Greetings to all of you who are joining us from many time zones. I'm Larry Diamond, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and with Glenn Tiffert, I lead our new Hoover project on China's global sharp power. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the release of our new report, Global Engagement, Rethinking Risk in the Research Enterprise. This work builds on the November 2018 report of our Hoover Institution Asia Society Working Group, China's Influence and American Interests Toward Constructive Engagement, which documented how China's Communist Party state has sought to penetrate, pressure, and compromise the integrity of American institutions, including universities and other research centers. Building on the pioneering 2017 DIUX report, China's Technology Transfer Strategy, our 2018 report sketched the myriad ways that the PRC has been trying to penetrate sensitive dimensions of the research enterprise in the United States and to misappropriate this knowledge both for economic benefit and military modernization. Neither of these earlier reports, however, was able to delve sufficiently deeply into a particular vulnerability of our scientific research enterprise, the engagement of our universities and research laboratories with foreign scholars from countries that are, or could well be, adversaries of the United States, and worse, foreign scholars from military-linked universities and research centers, like the Seven Sons of National Defense in China, which you'll hear about, and still worse, as you will hear, some PRC scholars who've deliberately tried to obfuscate their connections to China's military. This kind of foreign penetration presents a dual challenge to governments, universities, and researchers to balance active and informed vigilance with the benefits of scientific and technological cooperation across countries. Our new report marks the beginning of a new phase of work at the Hoover Institution to study what we are calling China's global sharp power. Over the coming year, we will build a clearinghouse of news, policy briefs, reports, and analysis on the PRC's global disinformation and sharp power activities around the world. We will examine in depth the history and practice of the United Front, the vast web of connections for projecting covert, coercive, and corrupting influence. And we plan to develop policy options and engage in training and educational efforts to counter these surreptitious influence activities. It's my pleasure to introduce the three authors of this report who will be speaking today. Dr. Kevin Gamache is Chief Research Security Officer for the Texas A&M University System. He is responsible for ensuring that the system's member universities are compliant with US government requirements for protecting sensitive federal information. He established and leads the Academic Security and Counter-Exploitation Program, an association of US universities established to help heighten security awareness in academia. Jeffrey Stoff is a senior analyst in the Department of Defense, focusing on technology transfer and critical technology protection issues, especially with regard to China. Over a 17-year career in the US government, he has worked closely with a number of federal agencies on national and economic security issues, and he supports interagency outreach efforts to the public and private sectors. Dr. Glenn Tiffert is a historian of modern China and a visiting fellow at Hoover, where he manages our projects on China's global sharp power and on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region. He works closely with academic and government partners to document and build resilience against authoritarian interference. And he serves on that same executive committee of the Academic Security and Counter-Exploitation Program. He's written widely on China's use of technology and sharp power to compromise and control intellectual inquiry. But first, we are pleased to welcome Senator Rob Portman to offer some opening remarks. As chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, Senator Portman has been a leader in Congress on issues related to China's improper influence. Working on a bipartisan basis, his subcommittee has shown a spotlight on the PRC's theft of American intellectual property, its misuse of its talent recruitment program for this purpose, and the lack of transparency in Confucius Institutes on college campuses. A former congressman, Senator Portman has also served as the U.S. Trade Representative and Director of the Office of Management and Budget. It's our pleasure now to welcome Senator Rob Portman.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. It's my pleasure to be with you today and to help welcome you all to the Hoover Institution's first ever China Global Sharp Power event, where today we'll be discussing a startling new report from Hoover on how the Chinese Communist Party has for many years used research partnerships between the United States and Chinese universities as a means of funneling cutting-edge research and intellectual property from our labs into their military. I want to thank the Hoover Institution, Jeff Stoff, Kevin Gamache, Glenn Tiffert for publishing this important report and contributing to the public discussion as we reassess aspects of our complex relationship with China and the Chinese government. The Hoover Institution has a long track record of publishing must-read reports on international affairs, and this report is no different. This report adds significant details and really interesting case examples on the ongoing debate about how we can better protect U.S.-funded research at our universities, government labs, and also private businesses. As this team of researchers lays out, in addition to the traditional forms of hard and soft power that we've all come to know, China has begun to employ a third type of power projection. They call it sharp power. As the name implies, Chinese sharp power to them is meant to penetrate the democratic institutions of their adversaries, including us, and weaken us from within. Hoover has looked at this before in terms of the effect the Chinese Communist Party has had on our state and local governments, our think tanks, and more. This time they're taking a much-needed look at the implications sharp power has for our U.S. research enterprise. The report lays out in detail how scholars working for CCP-affiliated universities have exploited the openness of our universities by collaborating with U.S.-based researchers on projects that directly benefit China's efforts to grow into a fearsome military adversary. Due to a lack of government oversight, along with deceptive behavior by Chinese researchers to conceal their affiliations with entities like Huawei and the People's Liberation Army, the Hoover Institution was able to find more than 250 articles co-authored by U.S. researchers, sometimes from federal taxpayer research facilities, and Chinese researchers that have worked for the Chinese military, sometimes on top-secret projects. These findings are unsettling, and they line up with what we've seen through our own research here in the Congress into this issue. Many of you know that as chair of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, I led a bipartisan investigation last year into China's organized and sophisticated efforts to steal U.S.-funded research. Over the course of a year, we learned how the Chinese Communist Party has used so-called talent recruitment programs, most notably its 1,000 Talents Plan, to systematically target the most promising U.S.-based researchers and pay them to take their American taxpayer-funded research to Chinese universities. As this new report shows, there have been a surprising number of collaborative research projects between U.S. researchers and academics from China's 7 Sons of National Defense, 7 universities administered by the Communist Party, that were founded with the express purpose of serving the interest of the People's Liberation Army. This is in line with what we heard from a State Department witness at a hearing we had last fall highlighting our report, who said that, and I quote, "The Communist Party in China has declared the Chinese university system to be on the front line of military-civilian fusion efforts for technology acquisition," end quote. At PSI, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, we use our bipartisan investigations to highlight and then solve problems. That's one way the congressional oversight should work. After more than a year studying this problem, I introduced what's called the Safeguarding American Innovation Act, along with Senator Tom Carper, the ranking member of PSI, and a group of bipartisan senators, to ensure that we in the United States can get our house in order and stop this theft of our intellectual property, our innovation, our research. It will also reform the foreign researcher visa application process, require more safeguards on sensitive research from our university institutions and others, help us to better track where our grant money is going. Importantly, it will also ensure that individuals are held accountable for failing to disclose their foreign ties on federal grant applications, because as it stands, our law enforcement agencies can't go directly after researchers for hiding their foreign conflicts of interest while taking taxpayer grant money. As with the PSI report we did, this new Hoover Institution report provides very concerning insight into China's sophisticated efforts to steal U.S. research for their own economic and national security gain. Through a detailed review of scientific publications, the report lays bare how for decades the Chinese military's vast network of state-sponsored universities encourage and direct its researchers to gain access and influence at U.S. research institutions. The report also highlights recommendations that are worth considering when thinking about how U.S. colleges and universities can ensure transparency and reciprocity while at the same time protecting its professors and researchers' hard-earned intellectual property. I look forward to reviewing the recommendations from the report more closely as the Senate continues to work on solutions to the problems that have been pointed out. Finally, I particularly want to thank Kevin and Jeff for their cooperation during the PSI's recent investigations into China. They both provided us with valuable insights to make the subcommittee's work more informative, useful, and accurate. Kevin has pushed the edge on research security efforts as Chief Research Security Officer for the Texas A&M University System. His policies and programs can serve as a model for other universities seeking to promote transparency, but also protect against research theft. Jeff's work with the Department of Defense continues to be irreplaceable in helping the U.S. government better understand and combat the threats to our research enterprise posed by China. As Larry Diamond wrote in the foreword to this report, the first line of defense is always knowledge. I believe this report contributes to the foundation of knowledge necessary to effectively and efficiently protect our national security. So thanks again to the Hoover Institution for the opportunity to speak with you all today on this important topic. And I look forward to following more of the work from Hoover's project on China's global sharp power.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Senator Portman, for that generous introduction and for your leadership in helping America close the vulnerabilities in our research enterprise. Today, we introduce a report that we hope will change the way our universities, national labs, and even private industry assess and manage the risks of their engagements with foreign partners. We believe, and I hope you'll agree after hearing our findings, that the time is ripe for such a rethink, and it is long overdue. This report has two parts, which each of my co-authors will present in succession. Jeffrey Stoff will lay out the empirical case for why business as usual is no longer tenable. More specifically, he will walk through a rich record of U.S. research collaborations with 7 universities that are integral to the modernization of China's defense, research, and industrial base, the so-called 7 Sons of National Defense. These are the places that graduate the scientists and engineers who imagine and build China's weapons of tomorrow, and who will help Xi Jinping achieve the technological and manufacturing leaps necessary to reach his strategic goals. We believe that supporting these objectives by collaborating with researchers from those institutions is not in the interests of the United States. Next, Kevin Gamache will follow with a concrete answer to the question, what is to be done? My job is to give you some policy framing. Let me start by saying that our motivations are purely constructive. More specifically, we are all about fixing this in a way that preserves the openness and institutional autonomy of the U.S. research enterprise, which is the envy of the world, and that upholds the fair dealing that exemplifies America at its best. This report cites specific cases, but only in the spirit of demonstrating that the problem is real. Assertions without evidence are worthless. If your institution is among the 115 we found that had research collaborations with the 7 Sons, know this: we believe that it could have happened to almost anyone, because our system for managing foreign engagement risk is tragically flawed. In short, we reject scapegoating. That is also why you will not hear us identify by name the participants in the collaborations that we studied. We prefer to keep the discussion focused on problematic relationships and practices, not on individuals or ethnicity. In May, when the president cited China's ambitious program of military-civil fusion as a rationale for rewriting the rules for visas for certain students and scholars from China, critics said there was no evidence behind his assertions of a threat, that it was a provocative solution in search of a problem. That particular criticism dies today. Why does this report single out China? First, all indications are that the types of problems we identify are most acute with respect to China, and China is the closest peer competitor in geostrategic terms to the United States, so the stakes are higher. At the same time, we believe that the failures I just alluded to apply to collaborations with other nations. They are systemic in nature. We document our methodology in an appendix so that others can replicate and extend it in any way they please. Given what we found by turning over just a few stones, there is likely much more out there. A typical argument has been, what's the big deal? Science is global. This research is fundamental and openly published and available to anyone who subscribes to the journals in which it appears. It's not like those Chinese scientists are working on our classified programs. This misses the point and underscores how the problem we are flagging today is fundamentally about mindset and shared responsibility. If the value of the American research enterprise was reducible to the information content of its published work, then few would come here. It's expensive after all. They would just stay in their home countries and read more. They come to American research institutions to tap US resources such as expertise, training, labs, and data. They learn the art of science here, how to replicate difficult experiments, manage labs, operate complex apparatuses. They develop professional networks that span the globe. All of this is good, except when scientists in question work for institutions that have a primary mission to support the defense establishment of a rival power that points missiles at us and bullies our allies, that runs the most comprehensive authoritarian surveillance apparatus on the planet, and that locks up more than 1 million people in concentration camps. It is really not that hard to understand. Notice that I say scientists from those institutions. We are not calling for a ban on scholarly exchanges with China. Far from it. I personally believe that the majority of PRC scholars and students on campus may pose no security risk whatsoever, and I welcome them. As anyone who has taught students from the PRC can tell you, they are among the best, and I've written strong letters of recommendation for some. This is not about that. But I am worried that our research institutions are doing such a poor job of filtering out those who do pose a risk that others will take away their discretion and make the decision for them. We know what that might look like. You need only consult some of the draft legislation working its way through Congress. Legislation and regulatory rulemaking can be a part of the solution, but they are blunt instruments. They create compliance burdens, open up new gaps, flag the best available threat information, and are prone to circumvention strategies by nimble adversaries. If our research enterprise wishes to maintain the latitude it currently enjoys to manage its own affairs, it will have to take responsibility for leading in this area. It is time to put the current formalistic compliance-driven model behind us. For the purposes of our argument, we assume in the report that the activity we document was legal. But as we all know, that is not the same thing as saying that it was a good idea. Our research enterprise needs to start asking that question systematically, or someone in Washington will do it for them. Likewise, law enforcement has a critical role to play here, but as in other spheres of our society, we are asking it to do too much, to handle deeper structural problems that it is not suited to fixing. The FBI and DOJ have limited resources. They typically pursue cases that present prosecutable crimes, and by that point, harms have already occurred. Moreover, as I've just said, there is a universe of deeply troubling activity that flourishes beneath the threshold of explicit criminality. We shouldn't be in the position of calling the cops for that. There need to be other tools available. How much better would it be to engage in more prevention? In the spirit of being part of the solution, our report delivers a coherent, integrated, practical program for getting out in front of the problem that is informed by the principles of operational security and capability maturity modeling. Institutions can take this program and tune it to their local circumstances. The point is to empower them to make better and more granular decisions on their own terms, to think strategically and to be proactive and adaptive in partnership with government. We want to change the paradigm. I invite you to download and read the full report, which is available now on hoover.org, and to join us in the coming months and years as we dig deeper into China's global sharp power. With that, let me hand off to my colleague, Jeff Stoff, who will take you into our findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn and Larry, for those introductions, and Senator Portman for those kind remarks. First, let me provide a disclaimer. I do work for the U.S. government, but this project was done on externally, unofficially, and all the opinions, assessments, recommendations are our own and do not reflect U.S. government position or endorsement. And my comments and discussions today will be germane specifically to this report and only this report. With that said, what I'm going to do is dive a little bit into an overview of these 7 sons, the chapter 1 of this report, the 7 sons, schools of defense, national defense, and the collaboration that we identified with U.S. institutions, and then I'll provide some key findings and highlight a couple of the recommendations. So if you can see here on the screen, first let me talk to you a little bit about the 7 Sun schools that you see on the left. Just basically, they all originated from People's Liberation Army, or PLA, military engineering and technical academies originally. Although now they are ostensibly civilian schools, their primary mission continues to is to support the R&D and industrial base, the defense R&D base, promote civil military fusion efforts, which are basically policies and practices to identify military applications to civilian research. And therefore, it is safe to assume that all of these schools will seek military applications to scientific and engineering research conducted there as a matter of policy. They all partner with major Chinese state-owned defense conglomerates, and they serve as a training ground for future military leaders and technicians working on weapon systems and defense programs. And now, if you look at this corpus here on this slide, this is what we examined over just over a 6-year period. We examined collaboration as revealed through scientific literature, authors from one of these 7 schools, and co-authors from U.S. institutions. As mentioned earlier, a total of 254 publications were identified through this corpus, involving 115 separate U.S. institutions. Of that 115, there were 7 Department of Energy national laboratories, as well as several other federal research facilities, and then the rest of them were predominantly academic institutions. If we move on, we can move on to, I'm going to talk about 4 key findings that we have, and then a few recommendations, and then turn it over to Kevin. So one of the key findings that we had were, although we examined a corpus derived from a domestic Chinese aggregator of scientific and technical journal literature, a lot of the corpus of literature were actually English language material. And however, we did some supplemental research, and we found that a lot of the most revealing information on the China-based entities and institutions and individuals came from Chinese language sources. And in fact, there were a number of subdivisions and laboratories at these schools that used innocuous sounding English names and or provided very sparse information on their structures in English language sources. A quick example is Northwest Polytechnic University has a key lab that in English literature is described as a state key laboratory. However, the Chinese indicates it's a national defense key laboratory. And there are numerous other examples of that highlighted in chapter 1 of this report. And thus the obfuscation or misrepresentation of the ties to these defense programs obviously complicates efforts by U.S. research institutions to evaluate the partnerships that they have, particularly with these 7 Sun schools, and raises questions on transparency and integrity. One of the other findings that we had documented some of these direct ties to China's military programs and defense conglomerates and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. For example, Harbin Institute of Technology, one of the most prolific in terms of collaboration with U.S. institutions, has known partnerships with 2 major Chinese state-owned aerospace defense conglomerates, as well as close collaboration with the PLA's General Armament Department, which is now known as the Equipment Development Department, and the PLA Rocket Force, which was formerly known as the Second Artillery Force, which manages China's nuclear missile arsenal. In this corpus, we found 3 articles specifically that collaborated with a Seven Sun School, a US institution, and a subsidiary of one of these aerospace conglomerates known as the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, or CALT for short. And CALT develops most of China's liquid and solid fueled surface-to-surface missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, etc. And within this corpus of these three articles, one of them involved a U.S. institution, Northwest Polytech National Defense Key Lab, and a division of this missile design house, CALT. Interestingly, the Northwest Polytech co-author also appears to have worked extensively on classified research programs because his bio and his CV lists a bunch of projects and programs with a bunch of X's in its funding codes or project names, and that's a likely indicator that that's a classified research program. Another example from this corpus involved a U.S. institution, Nanjing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, U.S. institution, and funding support came from that missile design house, CALT. And that particular article involved a research on hypersonic vehicles. And hypersonics is of critical concern to the U.S., given a potential capability for the PLA to outmatch U.S. military dominance. And I need to caveat that we did not do technical evaluations of this research. However, just on the surface, that particular article on hypersonics appears to be more on the applied spectrum than a basic and fundamental research. And I encourage further inquiry from technical experts to determine the true nature of that research, and it wasn't really basic or fundamental, given the partners involved. Another key finding that we had in the report involved 5 of the 7 Sun schools published graduate theses and dissertations that credited U.S. government funding support, particularly the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. These authors, we did some follow-up research on these graduate students, and they all were visiting students at U.S. institutions for part of their graduate degree programs, and nearly all of them were funded by the China Scholarship Council, which is a central government Ministry of Education run organization to fund folks to study abroad. But this involvement raises a few questions. The first is the Chinese government intentionally placing students into key U.S. research programs to gain access to this federally funded research and incorporate that back into their 7 Suns programs? And secondly, philosophically, should the U.S. institutions be training students from these institutions that are so well integrated with the PRC military as part of their PhD programs, for example, that could ultimately adversely impact U.S. national security? And what further inquiry is required, because we don't know, but did any of these visiting graduate students that credited U.S. government funding support, were they recipients of those grants in terms of stipends or et cetera? And that needs to be looked into further. One last finding that we had was more on the moral and ethical spectrum beyond simply national security concerns. In one particular article we identified in this corpus involved Northwest Polytech University, one of the 7 Suns, a U.S. university, and the Xi'an Engineering College of the People's Armed Police. The People's Armed Police, or the PAP for short, is a paramilitary force overseen by the Communist Party Central Committee and the party's Military Affairs Commission. And the PAP performs domestic surveillance and security functions for the Communist Party to maintain control over its population. What is more troubling is the fact that that particular PAP school in question on this article subsequently merged with the PAP's Urumqi Command College, which is located in the capital of Xinjiang. And the PAP in Xinjiang is deeply involved in what many consider in the international community the most oppressive surveillance regime in the world, and involves widespread extrajudicial detentions and forced mass internments of ethnic minorities, particularly Uyghur Muslims, in these concentration or re-education camps. And further, the PAP-affiliated co-author in this study appears to have no online presence, no CV or bio or faculty page, which makes it very difficult for the U.S. institutions to really understand who they're partnering with. So to sum up a few of these findings, what we found throughout this paper, and there are many, many other examples, that there are clear evidence of diversion of this research towards military application, or at least that's their intent given the collaborating partners. And in a few examples, we definitely should look into to determine is the research itself genuinely basic or fundamental? Is it really more on the applied spectrum, given that missile design academies are involved, for example? And another key point that we mentioned earlier, but it's worth repeating, is this evidence of deliberate obfuscation or opacity on the departments and the faculty involved. And there are a number of examples we provide in this study in Chapter 1 that show faculty pages being blank or denied from US Internet points of presence, or again, misleading nomenclature for these institutions. And that raises very serious transparency and integrity concerns with who the United States are partnering with. Lastly, I will mention a few of the recommendations in Chapter 1. I'm not going to go through all of them, but specifically, we outlined a very detailed methodology, and there's an appendix to Chapter 1 that describes how we conducted this survey of this corpus of literature. And we strongly encourage more scholarship examining many of the other articles involved in collaboration with US institutions, because we only looked at a few select examples. And we also recommend others look into collaboration with these 7 Sun schools with other nations, advanced nations are allies, because these 7 schools have extensive international collaboration. It's not just with the US. Further, we recommend replicating this methodology to examine other PRC schools that at minimum are intimately involved in military-civil fusion efforts. For example, there are over 50 civilian universities that are co-administered by the State Administration of Science and Technology Industry for National Defense, say that 10 times. And these 50-some schools are also integrated in their defense programs, and looking at the collaboration occurring there for the same purpose would be valuable, but beyond the scope of this particular report. Lastly, one of the other recommendations we had was, given that some of this research, particularly the People's Armed Police example, there are efforts to divert this research for activities that are inimical to our values and interests. And we recommend that research institutions create some sort of common moral or ethical standards for research collaboration, and create a unified way where there's a common agreement on whether or not U.S. entities should be collaborating with some of these partners. That's all. I'm out of time, and I want to turn over to Kevin. And what he's going to do is he's going to describe a lot more on. So we've articulated a lot of the concerns that through this collaboration, and given the limitations that U.S. institutions have in figuring all this out, this took a fair amount of work on our part. Kevin and Glenn have come up with a very prescriptive set of measures on how institutions can build capabilities and programs to do just that. Thank you for your time.
Well, thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff alluded, Chapter 2 of this report answers the question, what is to be done? Our report establishes a structured process for delivering due diligence in a manner that is specific to the research environment. Due diligence is the cornerstone of any risk management program. In the context of foreign engagements, institutions and researchers must ensure that all of the participants in a prospective collaboration are clearly documented, irrespective of whether that collaboration would be formal or informal. They must also be able to verify the collaboration's nature, scope, and purpose are well-defined and transparent, consistent with relevant laws and regulations, and undertaken with full knowledge and consent, and in a manner that avoids harm to core values and national interests. So how can we conduct due diligence required to mitigate the risk? In our report, we suggest the establishment of a global engagement risk assessment and management program, or GRAMP. Reclaiming control over foreign engagement risk begins by bringing all of an institution's international engagements under the governance of a unified strategic program. This program would impose coherence on policies and processes that rigorously assess the nature and degree of foreign risk engagement and guide proportionate measures to mitigate those risks to acceptable levels. A GRAMP would, for example, establish processes to identify possible downstream applications of research undertaken in a collaboration with foreign entities or research that might be a target for foreign interference or misappropriation. It would systematically vet foreign entities across an institution, overseeing monitoring of computer networks for unauthorized exfiltration of research data and the implementation of research data loss prevention. An effective GRAMP can play a major role in enhancing the security of an institution's personnel, facilities, and intellectual capital. For such a program to be effective, personnel must be aware of existing threats, be able to implement countermeasures when appropriate, and be observant of non-traditional collection activities directed at their institution. The program could also support jointly administered regional vetting centers and secure computing enclaves, which would allow member institutions to spread costs, pool resources, and provide internal clients with security as a service at economies of scale. These regional facilities would establish cooperative points of contact with government partners to facilitate information sharing and compliance. So our second recommendation would be to establish a strategic global engagement review office, or GRO, at each institution to provide administrative leadership, oversight, and coordination of the GRAMP, and to liaise with relevant federal agencies. This office would be a stable, accountable authority with the institutional stature to drive its strategic global engagement risk assessment and management program to success across multiple constituencies. The office would supervise program implementation and exercise unified leadership over foreign engagement risk policies and processes across the institution. In a typical university setting, it would report and make recommendations directly to the provost and advise other principals on foreign engagement risk. It would complement and coordinate with other units such as export control and facility security that are commonly under the authority of the Vice President for Research. And finally, it would regularly convene and chair a body similar to an institutional review board that would include the university's research security officer, authoritative representatives from the offices of the provost and vice presidents for research and international affairs, from the Council of Principal Investigators, and from the Office of General Counsel. And depending on the matters before it, even relevant area and subject matter experts and senior representatives from the institution's development, sponsored research, and government relations offices. If you could put up slide number 2, please. Most importantly, we think it's important to change the paradigm. As Glenn mentioned in his opening remarks, the Global Engagement Review Office would be the cornerstone of a more robust approach to managing the foreign engagement risks that research institutions increasingly face, without a corresponding paradigm shift from the compliance-driven focus that we currently have to proactive operations security. However, its full potential might not ever be realized. So the Opsec model provides a very simple, structured method for thinking about your foreign engagement risk by considering 5 basic questions. First, what type of information needs protecting? Answering this question allows you to identify your sensitive data, including your research, your intellectual property, your export control information, and employee information. This will be the data that you will need to focus your resources on protecting. Second, what threats do you face? You should identify potential threats for each category of information you deem sensitive and be cognizant not only of third parties trying to steal your information, but of potential insider threats. Third, what are your vulnerabilities? Analyze your security gaps and other vulnerabilities. You should assess your current safeguards and determine what, if any, loopholes or weaknesses exist that may be exploited to gain access to your sensitive data. Next, examine whether your data, your operations, or your people are at risk. Appraise the level of risk associated with each vulnerability. Rank your vulnerabilities using factors such as the likelihood of data exfiltration happening, the extent of damage you would suffer, and the amount of work and time you would need to cover or need to recover. And then finally, what protective measures should you take? This is the last step in the process to create and implement a plan to reduce threats and mitigate risks. This could include updating your hardware, creating new policies regarding sensitive data, or training faculty, staff, and students on sound security practices and university policies. So once again, we're advocating a 5-step structured process that can be used to examine and mitigate risks across each institution. Our next recommendation would be to embrace maturity modeling to consolidate and develop your capabilities. And adoption of a global engagement maturity model would establish a methodology for formalizing and optimizing a risk assessment and management program from inception to full integration within an institution's operations. Such a model defines a ladder that institutions can climb to achieve and communicate preparedness for more demanding work requirements. Combining the maturity model with Opsec promotes growth and optimization in an institution's capabilities. As your GRAMP maturity increases, so does your awareness of risk and your ability to mitigate that risk. Okay, if you could take the slide down. So we also recommend establishing a government-sponsored entity to support better decision-making. Research institutions have unequal resources and capabilities and cannot mitigate foreign engagement risk alone. Government support is essential, but currently fragmented and scoped too narrowly. A new interagency entity combining the equities of multiple government stakeholders and their open source data streams could provide an urgently needed unified point of contact for research enterprise on compliance matters and foreign engagement risk. This organization could deepen relationships of trust, facilitate routine information sharing, and enhance research and analysis so that institutions can make better and more granular decisions for themselves. In summary, we've laid out a structure that will allow the research community and government to reinvent their approaches to foreign engagement risk so that they can meet one another in the middle, each bringing to the table what it does best. And I will turn it over to Larry.
For your really extraordinary, lucid and concise, we're running beautifully on time, presentation of some of the essence of this report. What I'd like to do now, if I may, for the three of you, is present a number of questions and ask you to take a few notes, because if we go question by question and ask each of the three of you to respond, we're not going to get very far. So let me present several questions and ask each of you in the order that we began to tackle, two or three of them. I want to begin with a question that wasn't asked, but that I've often heard from university research vice provosts and managers and compliance officials and so on, which is, look, it's not our job to figure out who these people are. If they're given visas to come here, now we're talking about people who are coming here to do graduate study. They should be vetted by the federal government. And once they're vetted and given a visa to come and do their work, it's not our problem to figure out whether they're working for the Seven Sons or not. So how would you respond to that? And to a more specific question that was asked, is it your recommendation that U.S. colleges and universities review all the relationships that they have with the Seven Sons institutions? And do they need a different process for doing so? Kevin, I think you began to speak to this. I'll also kind of extend what you said, Kevin, or what you proposed on action, and be a little more practical. We're in a difficult financial period, a severe financial recession for the country and for universities. So are you talking about hiring new people to do this Global Engagement Review Office? Is there a way of doing everything you are asking universities to do without them making significant new financial commitments that they may not have the financial capacity for right now? Someone asked, what is your opinion on the recent Jason report's conclusion that it is, quote, neither feasible nor desirable to control areas of fundamental research beyond the mechanisms put in place by NSDD 189. I guess that's a National Security Decision Directive or something like that, that one of you could speak to. And then, of course, someone says, well, we've known about this vaguely, at least for a long time, and they want to know what more we can do to prevent our intellectual property from being stolen. There have been questions posed that go beyond the strict writ of your mandate, for example, to ask about private research labs and corporate research labs, and whether the methodology that you are recommending here for universities and federally funded research labs could be carried over. Are there any lessons that can be learned from them? And how do they manage these risks when they have a lot fewer resources, perhaps, than a large research university would have? So Glenn, why don't we go to you first, and then Jeff, and then Kevin to answer some of these questions?
Sure. I'll start with the first question that you posed, which is the very common argument that this is not our responsibility, this is the government's responsibility. And I think that there's a certain amount of truth to that. The government has not been doing a systematic, good job of vetting people who apply for visas to enter the United States. And research institutions have, I think, wrongly supposed that just because someone was granted a visa, they were low risk. So there's a sort of mismatch in understanding about what's going on. Now, the administration has currently announced that it intends to change those visa rules and tighten vetting, and it remains to be seen exactly how that's to be done. But this, I think, is an example of the administration and government stepping up to do more of its end of the bargain. Now, of course, the problem with that is there were howls of protests from universities that they were perhaps interfering in the flow of students into their programs and interfering with the openness of the US research enterprise. So there's a little bit of playing both sides of the argument going on from the research sector. Now, it seems to me that if research institutions which wish to preserve the discretion that they've traditionally had to manage their own affairs, they have to step up and do more of this for themselves, because otherwise Washington will do it for them. And it's not in the research institution's interests, I imagine, for that to happen. And so really, and there are also strong government contracting requirements and legislation that are coming down the pipeline that are going to compel them to do this. And so really, I think we've kind of crossed the hump on this. And now it's a question of implementing. And this is where Chapter 2, I think, is key. With respect to the question of financial burden, that's absolutely correct, Larry. This is, in some sense, the worst time to be asking universities to take on more responsibility. But a key part of what we say in Chapter 2 really is that, at least at some institutions, a lot of these ingredients are already in place. What's missing is the strategic vision that ties it all together. That's where our program comes into place. And I'm going to let the others step in here and respond to the others and add to what I've said.
Okay, I guess I'm up. I will also address the first question regarding vetting government responsibility versus academia. The only thing that I can really say behind that is the report we demonstrated that there are many examples, and likely many more, of deliberate obfuscation and misrepresentation of these individuals, their backgrounds, what they've worked on, and even where they work. For example, they may say they're part of one department at a university, but they really are working at a different one that we know is conducting defense research programs. And so they're manipulating the process to apply for research positions or to study in the United States. And so the onus is going to have to probably be on both sides, as Glenn had mentioned, where much more detailed inquiry into these programs, these departments at these universities, the faculty, et cetera, particularly when we're talking about these types of universities like the Seven Sons, which are of obvious concern. It remains to be seen how this will happen, as Glenn mentioned, regarding new rules on visa vetting, et cetera, that we'll have to see how that plays out. But I agree with Glenn that the onus needs to be as much on the research institutions in trying to identify who these folks are, because they obfuscate, and we provide a lot of detailed tools on how to do that. Regarding, I won't go into too much detail, but regarding the question on the NSF report and the National Security Decision Directive 189, which involves basically a standing policy that states that anything designated as basic and fundamental research is not subject to any export control or regulatory oversight, and if there were national security considerations with that research, it should be classified. And that position has been reaffirmed. And so the challenge that we collectively have, the US research institutions, is the examples in this report show that, first, it's not always clear that the research that's being published is basic or fundamental. And that needs to be examined a little bit more closely, even with the examples we have, and there are probably many others. They may be doing more applied, and it's just skirting that system or oversight process. Another possibility is that China is very good at adapting and identifying commercial or weapons applications to research, perhaps more efficiently in some cases than the US, and the transfer or the translation of something basic and fundamental turns applied pretty quick, and is somewhat missed or misunderstood. And so there are challenges with having the notion that all basic and fundamental research is completely fine. And we also, again, we point out that whether it is or not, and whether the intent of the research that's being conducted or published is purely for benign or civilian purposes, that doesn't mean that nefarious institutions may find some harmful applications to it. And at minimum, universities and institutions need to be aware that that's occurring and try to monitor if and when that's occurring and make adjustments accordingly to the partnerships that they have. The last question, and then I'll turn over to Kevin, which is a great one, regarding, hey, does this apply to private or corporate research funding? And I would say absolutely. The methodologies will apply. Of course, it's not a one-to-one comparison, because presumably not all of the private funded research or corporate research is being published openly. And so our methodology may limit in terms of identifying a corpus of published literature to see who these people are working on. However, there is certainly a subset of privately funded or corporate funded research that ultimately gets somewhere into a published record, and some of that methodology would absolutely apply. The other methodology is, again, going back to examining these institutions themselves. When in the report, we detail a lot of the subcomponents and departments and functions of these schools, and that can be done more widespread across a lot of institutions in China. And so there are times where somebody may be coming or working on privately funded research that may be coming in that came from some of those institutions, and that should raise a flag. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. I've said enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, I'll start with the first question about vetting, and kind of echo what Glenn and Jeff both said. But when I look at vetting, and this is something that my office does pretty extensively within the Texas A&M University system, I don't think we can look at this as a one and done process. When we are talking about mitigating risk, part of the mitigation of risk involves an ongoing process to ensure that we know who is working on our research. So, for those who say it's not our job in a university, my response would be, this is a national level imperative. And a university has as much, if not more, of a role to play here than the State Department does, because we should be interested in understanding and being able to mitigate the risks to our respective institutions. So if you accept the fact that it's an ongoing process, universities absolutely have a role to play. It's a team effort. We're all in it together. We all have different pieces of the puzzle. So I think it's got to be a cooperative effort between the federal government and the universities. With regard to the expense of some of the proposals that we are making, I would argue that the resources exist by and large within the university right now. It's just a matter of rearranging the resources, establishing priorities, establishing processes that pull all the right people together. So, everybody has the same information upon which to make a decision. Yeah, it's true. You could throw people and money at this process, but I think the most important thing is the process, and the resources, in my estimation, are there already in a university. They're just not being utilized as efficiently and effectively as possible. With regard to the Jason's report, I think what we're advocating here is not counter to what's in the Jason's report, but supports it as well. What we are talking about is not trying to do away with something. It's trying to understand the risks so that you can put the proper mitigations in place to continue to do what you're doing.
Going to advise our audience we'll go a little bit longer. I'd like to try and get in one more round of Q&A at least. I'll group together some questions. One has to do with where we recruit collaboration from. And I do know that one of the concerns that many universities and professors who host Chinese students in their physics labs or whatever it might be is, you know, if they can't bring these students to the United States, they may not have many graduate students. And so how do we weigh that risk to the potential dramatic reduction in the flow of talent? And there's another concern about, again, Glenn spoke to this a little bit, but I don't know if there's any more granular way of getting into this, of how we can avoid a racist or xenophobic national stereotyping on Chinese, and certainly even we know the risk historically in the United States of enlarging that further to people of Chinese ancestry. So there's another question about allies, which is to what extent we can and should be working with our democratic, let's say, advanced industrial allies to develop common approaches here and information sharing. An interesting question, I wonder if you pondered it in the report or elsewhere, are there any circumstances where there might be positive benefit to collaborating with researchers at the Seven Sons institutions or with the institutions themselves? Might they have knowledge that's, that we can glean about the institutions or the substantive work that might be valuable, or is it just not worth the risk? There's a question about government oversight. Of course, we have Senator Portman's permanent subcommittee on investigations, but do you say anything about how much further federal government standing oversight capacity should be ramped up? And there's a question, I think I'm going to start with you now, Kevin, because so many of these questions ultimately come back to you. Has the GRANT concept been shared with stakeholders, universities, university associations, and so on? Well, you've just produced this report. You may say something about how you intend to roll it out and what's already been done to bring together stakeholders to begin to dialogue on these issues. And then there's a question about the flow of American researchers in the other direction into Chinese universities with the talent program and otherwise, and how that might feed into the larger problem. So Kevin, why don't we start with you this time?
Okay. So let me ask, I'll answer your questions in reverse order here. Yes, there have been some discussions with my counterparts on the GRANT process, the operations security process, and essentially the structure that we're proposing over the last couple months as we've developed this program. As Larry mentioned in the introduction, we started a group called the Academic Security and Counter-Exploitation Program about 2 years ago. And that forum will play a large role in the dialogue that's going to be required to carry this report forward within the academic community. And obviously other organizations like the AAU, APLU, ACE will also play an important role in that discussion. As to whether other countries or allies are involved in this, I am aware that the State Department is working with Canada, Australia, and others who have similar problems in this area. So that dialogue with our allies is ongoing as well. Obviously, things have been slowed over the last 5 months by the COVID pandemic, but those conversations are ongoing. With regard to the question about if they can't bring foreign students here, then they won't have any graduate students available. That's certainly, that's an issue. That's an issue that we understand. And, I want everybody to understand that, that is not what this report is about. It's not about excluding anybody from any country. It's about understanding your risks so that you can put mitigating measures in place. And, I think that fully supports bringing students from any country. We just need to understand, whether it would be appropriate to put mitigating measures in place.
I wonder if I could build on Kevin's point regarding that and address the very real concern that Larry raised regarding racist stereotyping. I think the worst thing we can do is to do nothing, because then that does in fact feed the stereotyping. That feeds the baby and bathwater solutions that advocate admitting no one into these programs. What we are proposing to do is to build a smarter process that allows us to make more granular decisions so we can filter out those people who pose risks and adopt calibrated mitigating measures to ensure that our programs remain safe. And then everyone else is granted access. And we firmly believe that this preserves the integrity of our institutions and is the best defense, I think, against stereotyping. We don't want to label any particular group on the basis of its national origin or ethnicity as a threat. Instead, it is individuals who have particular relationships or backgrounds, who work for certain defense agencies or for institutions that are closely tied to the PLA. That is what makes them a threat, not what they look like or what passport they carry. And we're not doing that now. And so it kind of feeds the worst impulses. With respect to allies and sharing, I think the best thing for us to do is get our own house in order to share information with our partners and build coalitions that can move forward together. And so we do, in fact, propose that in the report, in partnership with the US government and in partnership with our allies, as Kevin said, Canada, Australia, European partners. We're all facing similar challenges.
I'll add just a couple comments, kind of foot stomping what Glenn said, particularly with regards to risks of shutting the door, so to speak, particularly from Chinese students coming here. And that is not at all what we're examining. We specifically for this study looked at institutions that are the most egregious in terms of national security concerns, that have irrefutable ties to classified weapons programs and activities that are just not in our national interest. And the rest of the scientific and engineering community is not necessarily part of that. But when we dig deep, we identify these areas, and if we replicate this process, and we can be much more measured, as Glenn was saying, in who we allow in, and it's more of a small filter where we allow most people in, but we create a set of common guidelines saying this subset of entities or organizations should not be allowed to participate in our research enterprise because it's just too potentially damaging to our national security or our democratic values. And that is a very doable process. But it does take some additional research, as we pointed out, really digging deep into these structures and missions and subcomponents. And I also believe that working with allied partners collectively can identify these organizations. For example, an Australian think tank had done some initial work on that. We reference in the report, identifying some of these other schools and institutions that they considered of risk, national security risk. And so when you combine these efforts, we will have far more granularity on these programs that are of concern that then allow research institutions in the United States to make much more detailed, effective risk assessments on who's involving. And then and as Glenn said, everybody else is allowed in. That's what we're advocating. And going back to the ethnicity issue too, again, we just want to focus. I think the priority, in my opinion, is start with these most egregious national security and human rights related implication concerns, and start with that and build a model based on that. And you're probably 95% there in terms of solutions. There was one other comment I wanted to make. No, I forgot my chain of thought. Sorry. I guess that's it. Sorry.
Oh, I'm going to give each of you one last chance to make any additional comment you want to make briefly. We don't want to run too much over time here. I do want to note that this is, in a way, the first product of our new Hoover Institution project on China's global sharp power. We will formally launch the project in September and invite everyone on this conversation to join us again for that launch event. Glenn, there was a question about the broader effort and specifically about the China Influence Tracker. So why don't you say a word about that and any additional word you want to say in closing, and then I will give Jeff and Kevin the same opportunity for a final word. Go ahead, Glenn.
Sure. Thank you, Larry. Yes, among the first initiatives that we're going to launch as part of our China's Global Sharp Power project in the fall is something called the China Influence Tracker, which will be a one-stop shop portal that will document China's activities across a range of geographic and language spaces around the world in the sphere of economics, educational, cultural activities, all of the different spheres in which China applies what's known now as sharp power. So that people in different parts of the world can, in multiple languages, keep tabs and learn from what's happening with similarly situated partners elsewhere. So it's largely an information sharing endeavor. We're also going to do a larger project on the United Front as well. And so those are two of our large priorities going forward. Now, with respect to this particular report, I guess my closing thought would be this. It is strongly my opinion that right now the research enterprise and those who regulate it in the federal government have kind of fallen into a largely adversarial relationship. And it's a trajectory that we need to arrest. We need to partner. And it's largely because I think the paradigm is broken. The research enterprise has not been doing a good job of tracking its engagements with foreign partners. And as a result, those foreign partners have, in a sense, declared open season on our research. And the federal government has woken up to that and is deeply unhappy. And so it is about changing the paradigm and breaking out of that trajectory so that we can establish a more cooperative, mutually beneficial, and trustful relationship between our research enterprise and the government. And that's what we hope to do in this project in a way, like I say, that upholds the best that America can be.
I just want to thank Hoover again for their support in this effort and Glenn's Herculean efforts putting all this together. One quick final note, the risks that we were describing in this report, one of the challenges is we assume that most, if not all, of this activity is not illegal and may not even be in violation of federal grant rules or conditions. That remains to be seen. More inquiry would have to be determined specifically on cases whether there were violations of conflicts of commitment or interest, for example. But we presume that this is basic and open science and that there was no legal wrongdoing or activity occurring, and yet these still represent some very serious national security risks. As a result, this current binary test of legality versus illegality as the basis for forming risk, assessing risk, doesn't seem to be working. And that is the nuance here, and why Glenn and Kevin went through such pains to try to come up with a more robust risk assessment model that goes beyond that that category. That's all I had. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Hoover as well for sponsoring this and allowing me to participate. I think what this report does is it provides an opportunity in a framework for dialogue, and that's what's required right now. All the parties that have an equity in this need to come up with a solution that is fundamentally different than the way we're doing business. And I think that solution is out there. I think we can do things in a manner that are more effective and more efficient than we've been doing in the past. But that's going to require effort and dialogue on the part of everybody who has equity in the problem.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for really an extraordinary contribution to public policy and to our research enterprise in higher education and research labs in the United States, and of course to US national security as well. The motto of the Hoover Institution, which I'm very proud of, is ideas defining a free society. And what we're talking about here is preserving a world and a system of research and intellectual inquiry around the world where freedom can thrive. So I want to thank all three of you. I thank our audience who have tuned in from a wide variety of places in the US and abroad. And please stay tuned for other activities of the Hoover Institution and its new project on China's global sharp power. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.